All right, guys, this will be a pretty quick video. It's the third video for chapter 34, if you're just kind of, keeping tabs on the organization of it. And this one, we're going to talk about the war outside Europe. World War I started as a European conflict, and most of the fighting did take place on that continent, but it was actually a world war, and that fighting took place on several other continents as well. This was mostly the result of Europeans drafting their colonies into war service, though. But there were a couple of other areas that got involved that were not, European colonies. Let's first look at East Asia and the Pacific. Now, as the only non-Western industrialized power in the early 20th century, it was inevitable that Japan was going to get involved. By 1914, Japan was looking to expand its influence in the Pacific and saw the war as an opportunity to do so. It wanted control of Germany's sphere of influence in China. All right, now, Germany didn't have a big one, but you see it up here, okay? Germany is kind of like this reddish-brown area. It's up here near the Shandong Peninsula. Even though it wasn't the biggest, it was still a fairly important one because it was right off of the Yellow River, and it was fairly close to Beijing. And it was actually the closest out of all the European spheres of influence to the capital. So because it wanted control of this, Japan actually entered the war on the side of the Allies. Very different from World War II, where we think of Japan being, as part of the Axis powers, being a close ally of Germany. They actually wanted German territory in World War I. So they won control of German territory both in China and also in the South Pacific. Japan then took this new increase in status and tried to kind of roll it into gaining more control over China. In 1915, it issued to China the 21 demands. These were a set of demands, obviously, ultimatums that if China had given in to all of them, it would have essentially made China a protectorate of Japan. Right? Japan would not have officially made China a colony, but it would have given it significant control over it, especially when it came times to in terms of economics. The only thing that saved China at this time was Britain forced Japan to back off. Britain was not ready to have China be completely under Japanese control, so they talked the Japanese into easing up on a couple of the ultimatums. Still, the demand showed Japanese ambition to dominate the Pacific, and that would only increase in the coming decades. Other areas involved were Africa and Southwest Asia. Now, the scramble for Africa was a large part of the rivalries that culminated in the war beginning in the first place. All right, we talked about those in the chapter on imperialism. It was predictable, therefore, that Britain and France saw the World War I as an opportunity to gain control of German colonies in Africa. All right, you see, Germany didn't have as much as Britain and France, but still, there were some sizable ones. German South Africa, Southwest Africa, that today would be more Angola. You had German East Africa, Cameroon, and Togoland. So still, there was an important real estate that Britain and France had their eyes on with this. Despite some fierce resistance, Germany did lose all of its colonies by the war's end. Much more fighting, though, took place in Southwest Asia, which we more commonly know as the Middle East. Right, Southwest Asia is looked at as a little less Western-centric way of viewing, of naming that region. Now, the reason why there was a good bit more fighting in the Middle East was because of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was on the side of the Central Powers. Now, you look at the size of the empire in 1914, much, much smaller than it had been at the height of it. Basically, you've got Turkey over here. You've got kind of Iraq, Syria, only the perimeter of the Arabian Peninsula, but still some important areas such as Mecca, okay, the holy site of Islam there. Egypt is pretty much completely gone. Persia is completely gone. But, today it would be Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. Those are still under its control. So still large Arab areas in the Middle East. Britain thought that attacking the Ottoman Empire could have two benefits. One, it would weaken Germany's ally, so that would be a bonus. And two, Britain could gain control of the Dardanelles. Let me zoom in on these areas in here. Where's this? There we go. Okay. So the Dardanelles, let me move me here so you can see the whole thing. All right, so look at the zoom out map first. There's Turkey. All right, Anatolia, and then you zoom in here, and the Dardanelles Strait, it connects the Sea of Marmara, and then that would continue on into the Black Sea, and then that empties into the Aegean Sea, and then that would continue on into the Mediterranean Sea. So basically, you're controlling the whole strait from the Black Sea, Central Asia, into the Mediterranean. And this was obviously an important sea route that they could not only control in wartime, but also peacetime, and that could bring a lot of money for trade. Now, this campaign culminated in the Battle of Gallipoli. Now, you see here the Gallipoli Peninsula. The British were defeated by Turkish forces, and there were huge casualties, but the long-term consequences were even worse. You see, the British forces weren't really British. They were colonial forces composed mostly of Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand troops. This led to an awful lot of resentment among these colonies, that basically they were thrown out there as cannon fodder, that they were thrown for the wolves. And this helped strengthen national identities on all of those and lead to further movements for home rule in the coming decades. Now, a different kind of violence took place in a different part of the Ottoman Empire with the Armenian massacres. Armenia would be an area kind of up around here, right, bordering with the Russian Empire. That's what it is today. It was not a separate country back in the day. Armenians were the largest non-Muslim ethnic groups under Ottoman control. They were Christian. Religious tensions began to take the form of outright resistance in the late 1800s, and the Ottomans became convinced that the Armenians would seek independence through World War I, especially because they felt that the Armenians would side with Russia over them. And they also looked at what was happening in the Balkans, with Balkan states revolting against the Austria-Hungary Empire. So, combine this with a Turkish nationalist movement in the early 1900s that wanted to make everything about Turkish. Turkish had to be the official language, for to be official culture. Everything else became secondary. And the Ottomans had an awful lot of fears of treason for their ethnic minorities. And this led the Ottoman government to label Armenians as traitors. This was followed with mass evacuations that resulted in thousands of deaths from starvation and disease, while thousands more were just outright killed by violence. You see Armenian refugees living in the streets of what at the time was Palestine. You know, today it would be Lebanon and Israel. All total, close to 1 million Armenians were killed, and today it's actually branded as a genocide. Another issue the Ottomans had to deal with was Arab rebellion. Turkish nationalism that we just talked about, this made Arabs even more resentful of Ottoman rule. You know, they were not had been tired of being ruled by Turkish ethnics for a while, and the British used this to their advantage and helped to organize Arab revolts in Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, so even though, you know, we think of Europe as really being, you know, what World War I is all about, and it was the start of it and where most of the fighting, there was violence all over the world, you know, and that's why we do call World War I a world war. All right, so that wraps it up with kind of the different theaters of the war, and then in the next video, we will talk about how the war ends.